what America was and what it can become. This is Liberty Town Hall.
And welcome to Liberty Town Hall. Today we're talking about the Federal Reserve. Too big to fail or not? That's the question. Ken, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Glenn.
Federal Reserve. It's a creature that gets into every aspect of our lives.
Yes.
It's one thing that people know the least about in many ways. So on this show, we want to talk about, first of all, what is the Federal Reserve? Now, we're going to have to roll up our sleeves and get into this because although it's very complicated, it is very simple, and sorting out the two makes it a little bit more challenging sometimes. The Federal Reserve controls the U.S. money system. It's not controlled by the federal government anywhere near the way the Constitution describes it to be, right, Ken?
Correct.
However, the Federal Reserve gets appointments by the government,
yes,
as chairman and so on and so forth. So it's a quasi-government, but it's not. We have to understand the Federal Reserve is a private company. That's why when you hear people talking about audit the Fed, and it's not as easy as you think because they're a private company and you have to have justification for being able to force an audit. So what we want to do is look at, is the Federal Reserve too big to fail? And in order to do that, we have to figure out what the Federal Reserve is, right?
Correct.
Okay. Ken, how would you describe the Federal Reserve?
Federal Reserve is to use old Soviet terminology, it's a Politburo, which has a presidium, an oversight committee called the Open Market Committee.
Okay.
Now, the Open Market Committee...
That's the quasi-government part of it.
Yeah, that is the government part of it.
Okay.
People don't understand how they've done this. It's very intricate. Constitutional is a big question of how they've done this. And this Open Market Committee, there are 12 federal districts, and each of the chairmen of each federal bank within that district sits on the Open Market Committee. The Bernanke is appointed by the president on consent of the Senate. So it shows you the power, and he...
But at that point, once he's appointed, then nobody has any say over it, correct?
No, they do have say, but they don't have say. They concede their authority upon the appointment. That way, it's not my job kind of thing. I can't do it. The president of the Federal Reserve has to do it. It's
Chairman, yep.
Yeah, it's a catch-22 escape clause. And it's a very insidious operation of law they put together. And when we talk about the history from its foundation, as they like to say, at midnight on December 24th. And Woodrow Wilson's commentary when he left office, when he could still speak very little, he said it was a mistake to sign the bill, but I don't trust his words because he signed the bill.
He signed the bill.
And
Woodrow Wilson, you have to understand, Woodrow Wilson is my favorite president. I think he's done the most for progressive movements, followed up by a few other ones after that. But Woodrow Wilson really set the stage for the progressive movement and redistribution of wealth.
Yes, he did.
Not just in the United States, but part of World War I, which many people argue led to Hitler coming in World War II.
Yeah, it's the same war. It had a 20-year vacation.
It had a 20-year vacation, and Hitler rebuilt his power base.
Yes.
All around the sanctions that come from World War I.
Yes.
So by repressing them, it built up this massive nightmare, evil man.
Yeah, they gave him his stepping stone. He
Right.
could argue the foreign enemy.
Right.
And then we know it became insidious.
So that same thinking process is what give us the Federal Reserve.
Yes. The Federal Reserve basically became the oversight committee for all nationally chartered banks dating from 1863 as amended in 1864.
Right.
And there were supplemental acts. But the Federal Reserve Act was a result of the collapse of the Merchants Bank in New York in 1907. And the Merchants Bank in New York collapsed in 1907 when all the other banks wouldn't accept drafts drawn on its bank.
Right.
And the history there is the money center of New York was extremely powerful for farmers came for seed money every year. And that year they didn't need seed money because of James J. Hill, the Great Northwestern Railroad. He took his money and invested it in the local community, the local banks.
Right. And they were running a lot more conservatives on their loan ratio.
Yes.
In order to get into the bigger problem of the Federal Reserve, we have to understand a fractional reserve system. So I want to try to explain how the Federal Reserve makes money out of thin air. I know that's going to be hard to to explain, but we're going to explain how the Federal Reserve actually prints money and collects interest out of something they never had when we come back after these messages.
Are you a small business reaching out to a national audience or an established company seeking more exposure? Place your ad on Liberty Town Hall and reach up to 46 million homes nationwide. Call now for a quote.
And welcome back to Liberty Town Hall. We're talking about the Federal Reserve. Too big to fail or not? Have we had another crisis that we have to address now because of too big to fail? Ken, that's what we're trying to figure out here. In order to address this, I think we really need to go back to the very beginning of what was the banking system and how it was formed. It all went back to the goldsmith. There's a nice video out on the internet talking about the tale of a goldsmith. Okay, it's a good video. I hope everybody watches it. It's a video called Money as Debt. It's 47 minutes long. It explains in really the best clarity I've ever seen for explaining the Federal Reserve and the fractional reserve system. We have to separate the two between the Federal Reserve and the fractional reserve system, because bank lending was done on a fractional reserve system before the Federal Reserve was ever born.
Yes.
So if we go back, what year was that they passed that act?
Well, the modern act is 1863, the National Bank Act.
Right, the National Bank Act. That's where the federal government give private banks the ability to loan money on a fractional reserve system.
Yes.
Okay, so as long as they had so much gold in the bank backing up their bank notes,
right,
private bank notes, again, these are private transactions, they were allowed to do that.
Yes.
The problem come in was that if you had a conservative bank that did a fractional reserve of, let's say, 3 to 1 or 5 to 1, and then you had a liberal lending bank that would do a fractional reserve of 15 or 20 to 1. So when they started exchanging notes, the conservative bank would run out of cash. It just didn't work out.
Right.
So they claimed crisis mode, right?
Right.
And then in 1907, right, that's when it all kind of blew up in their face.
Yes.
And so 6 guys kind of snuck off to Jekyll Island in literally the dark of the night on a train, and they all went to Jekyll Island for like a week to 10 days, and they had to come up with a couple of things. 1, how do we convince the public that it's too big to fail? 2, how do we make them think that it's a federal government agency and not private? And 3, how do we lock up a monopoly to keep anybody else from doing our business? And so they come up with the name Federal Reserve. Well, I give you nothing federal about it, and there is no reserve, right?
Correct.
Money has become debt underneath this principle.
Yes. So
the fractional reserve system, if we take just for a second and we talk about that, the fractional reserve system says I can take a $120,000 house for collateral,
yes,
make brand new money, let's say a $100,000 loan, and loan money based on the collateral with just a little bit of cash in the bank.
correct.
Then when I loan that money out, let's say $100,000, it goes out in the economy. The person that buys the house ends up paying the plumber, the drywallers, and the carpenters, and that ends up circulating to the guy buying food at the grocery store. So the money goes into circulation in the economy. And then slowly it gets pulled out. Interest, which is, if anybody looks at their loans, you'll see that the interest portion is probably the bigger portion than your principal portion.
Yes.
But the principal portion is then erased completely.
Correct.
As the payment's made, it's destroyed. But the bank keeps the interest. So eventually, over time, is what happens is all that interest money comes out of the economy, the real money, and goes into the banker's pocket. That's where we're at now, where we don't have enough money being put into the economy. So the government steps up to the plate and says, here, we're going to dump more money into the economy. Otherwise, we can't keep making our interest payments to these banks.
Well,
and that's where the bank failure comes from,
yeah,
right?
It's more insidious than that. When they incorporated the Federal Reserve in 13 and put it in operation January 14, they had a 4-to-1 ratio.
4-to-1 ratio.
4-to-1
right.
was the original ratio, 25% gold and 75% paper.
So they actually had to have gold backing this up.
Yeah, they needed gold. And that's why the original notes from 1914 to March 9th of 1933 were gold certificates.
Right.
And the nomenclature was, this note is redeemable in gold at any Federal Reserve Bank or U.S. Treasury.
Right.
All right. Well, the Federal Reserve
And didn't it have a certain weight that dollar note was for?
Yeah, it was an ounce of gold.
Right. Well, if you had a dollar bill, then it didn't get you a full ounce.
It was 1/20th of an ounce.
Right. It was broke up.
Correct.
So that you were buying a weight of gold, not
Correct.
just a perceived value of gold.
You weren't,
so we had
you're
fixed
buying
real
an
value of gold.
Yeah, you were an absolute value.
Right.
And between January 14 and March 3rd of 33, the Federal Reserve Bank oversubscribed
And went
its
bankrupt.
reserves and went bankrupt.
So in 1933, the Federal Reserve System went bankrupt, and the taxpayers got hit with the bill.
Yes, they did. What they did is the first thing Franklin Delano did, the cousin of Theodore Roosevelt, is he issued an executive order closing all nationally chartered Federal Reserve member banks.
Right.
There were state banks, Canadian banks,
Local banks doing their own money, local lenders,
were
that was all fine.
They were fine.
Just
They
the
were,
Federal Reserve System banks
Federal
were
Reserve Bank,
done.
which were all national charters, were closed.
Right.
They were closed on March 3rd. They were closed for the business calendar week. They opened back up on March 9th under the Bank Conservation Act.
Which again, changed it again.
It was the first bailout.
It was a huge bailout. They restructured everything, and it was too big to fail. And so our money system, the very people that corrupted it were given more control over it.
Right.
Right?
That's generally how the Congress works.
So you have a crisis. You can't let a good crisis go to waste. The system is collapsed. We collapsed it.
Yep.
And the punishment we're going to get is you're going to give me more money.
Yep.
And you're going to let me do more higher fractional reserves. We get to restructure this to keep it going.
Well, it's more. Well, then you look at the conversations between Morgenthau, who was Secretary of the Treasury, and Franklin Roosevelt, President, after March 9th. And literally what they did is each day they came and flipped a coin and determined arbitrarily the value of gold. They raised gold from March 9th.
They literally flipped the coin.
They flipped a coin and inflated the cost of gold.
Isn't that just... and that's how they ran it.
Yeah, that's how they ran it. And they ran gold up from a Federal Reserve note value, which was 20 notes to the ounce in 33 when they first printed the Federal Reserve note, which was not redeemable, which was not a gold certificate, it was a Federal Reserve note. They inflated gold from $20 an ounce to $35 an ounce.
Almost doubled the value.
Yeah,
so their fractional reserve really went down by that much.
Correct. And
Right.
the kicker is, I as a property owner, my values were halved.
Right.
I lost value.
And we're going to come right back to that and talk about the value of the dollar and how it's declined since then and how that really affects you when we return after these messages. Welcome back to Liberty Town Hall. We're discussing the Federal Reserve, too big to fail or not, and what is the actual impact on you. Ken, when we left just before the break, we were talking about how does this impact the average person? Okay, money's just being created as debt now, so as long as I have a mortgage or something I can put as collateral, I can make brand new money and put in the economy. I get to draw that money out of the economy plus interest, and I get to keep the interest. So we have an ever dwindling supply of cash that is being absorbed by interest by these banks, right? But what does that do for us? You were talking about them literally flipping a coin for the value of gold.
Yes.
Until it got to the point where they more than doubled the value of gold, which really cuts the value in half.
Yeah,
it takes $2 now for every dollar of gold.
Yeah, they inflated circulation.
Right. Where does that, what was the next stage in the process? They said give up on gold altogether by Nixon, right?
Well, Nixon took us off the gold standard, if I remember right, in 71, because then at that point he imposed as the President of the United States price controls.
Right.
On all statutorily controlled entities.
Right.
And people miss the mix here of statutory law being used to usurp our private rights of liberty.
Right. We talk a lot about our personal property rights.
Right, and this is a personal property right. And this inflationary spiral that Morgenthau and Roosevelt put in within 2 years of the Bank Conservation Act of 33 destroyed property values.
Right.
So your purchasing
so the value of the
halved.
dollar has gone down
Correct.
drastically because
Yes.
of this, right? When I was talking to somebody the other day, we were talking about, well, I don't see that in my day-to-day life. I don't see that. And
Go to
tried
the
to
gas
use
pump.
I was going to say I went to I used oil as
Yes.
as a good example because oil is sold globally.
Yes.
And if a barrel of oil costs $50 today, and it cost 100 federal notes tomorrow, the value of the oil didn't change.
Right.
The value of the dollar has been cut in half.
So my cost out of pocket, I need to scramble to find the inflated notes.
Right. You need to right.
And I cannot find the inflated notes because I'm either on what they call a fixed income, or I'm employed in a situation where the employer is also being affected by it, so he can't increase my compensation.
Right.
He cannot increase his cost against inflation.
But that's where all your stuff from the milk goes up to the electric you run, the utilities, all your utilities are the same way. All your products that you have to consume have gone up right through the roof because of this.
The best example I can give that most people can remember was the Iranian oil crisis of '79, the last 2
Correct.
years of
That was it,
James Carter. And oil inflated. And interest rates by the Federal Reserve went up to 21%. So it killed the economy. I was in a corporate business structure where we had corporate notes prior to the superinflation of Jimmy Carter. They were 6% notes written in $1970.
And so the value of those just went right to the toilet.
Yeah, so what happened is as the corporation, as more dollars came in, we paid off old money with inflated money. So the corporation was making, quote, profit on paper inflation. So they were seduced by the inflation. But the percentage of cost of operations, though we had a larger volume coming in, our percentage costs were the same. If it cost me in old money 10 cents, 10% of my profit to pay my staff, with the inflated money it was 10%, even though I was giving more inflated dollars to my staff.
But I got rid of my debt at a lower rate.
Well, we always used to joke about it. We ran out and ran up credit card bills like you couldn't believe because we were paying with tomorrow's cheaper dollars on goods we bought today, and the goods tomorrow would cost more than the inflated dollars. Our gas pump is the most prevalent point of that today.
You can see it real clearly.
You can see it clearly.
And you can almost see the dollar going up and down every day with the value of the gas.
Yeah, I'll give you a benchmark. In 1970, I paid 30 cents a gallon for gas. Today, I'm paying about $3 a cent.
$3.50.
That's 1,000% inflation.
Right.
That's what you're dealing with. I remember when they had the oil crisis, which pumped our money to the Mideast, inflated dollars. The barrel of oil.
Yeah, we spent a lot of money overseas to get oil.
It costs 50 cents to pump the oil out of the ground. The same oil wells they're pumping out of the ground today, so the infrastructure's in place. But like you said before the break, they're getting inflated dollars. Now, we used to cross the Bay Bridge in Maryland going to the Delmarva Peninsula, and we saw the oil tankers waiting for the inflated price to go up so they could pay off old debt.
Isn't that nice?
Yeah, and the bankers make the profit, and
but
we
the individual person that has to live day to day and deal with all this nightmare.
It's impossible.
They can't, they don't get to play these games with the money. So unless you're dealing with big dollars, and you can do this even on a 3-day or a week or a month cycle where you can move money around, you're going to get crushed in this process. You can't keep up with the deflated dollars.
Well, they came in with a cost of living allowances, COLA. And that was during the Nixon era with Social Security.
Right. Again, that's where we corrupted the Social Security system even worse.
Right. So they inflate the dollars going out to the pensioners, the fixed benefit. I don't want to call them pensioners. They're beneficiaries of a tax dollar. We have to start using the proper language for understanding. And so they put in, so people become inured to the system. They accept it. Oh, well, gee, we're going to get COLA tomorrow. Hey, we get more. And they don't realize more is less.
Right, and somebody else is going to be paying for it.
Right, and they're getting more dollars, but they're buying less with more dollars. They have to cut back because the inflationary cost hits the individual person in their rights.
It eventually comes up and hits the individual.
Correct.
That's where it gets paid, and that's where all this money is actually being consumed out. The very poorest in the economy is being crushed the worst, right?
Worst. Then you're creating a dependency class.
Right.
And we solve this dependency class. Right now, it's a break even where we have, there are approximately 120 million working Americans. There are 50 million Americans who are living off the 120 million who are being taxed through this inflated dollar to support this inflated system, which is controlled by federal law through the Federal Reserve. And the Bank Conservation Act of 1933, you need to read it because it says the Congress is controlling the economy through the Federal Reserve, and nobody understands it.
There we go back to Congress not doing their job.
Right.
When we return after this message, we're going to ask Ken, what do we do about the fact that the Federal Reserve's charter's due to be renewed? When we return after these messages.
Are you a small business reaching out to a national audience or an established company seeking more exposure? Place your ad on Liberty Town Hall and reach up to 46 million homes nationwide. Call now for a quote.
And welcome back to Liberty Town Hall. We're discussing the fact that the Federal Reserve basically has a hold on our monetary policy.
Yes.
They've had years of corruption built into the system, where now they have us in a too big to fail situation again.
Yes.
The Federal Reserve's charter is up for renewal. I guess instead of saying it's ending, it's in an automatic 20-year renewal cycle.
Right.
So we have a window that really is going to take us 20 years before this window opens again. Why should Congress renew the Federal Reserve's charter? And if you say no, what do we do about the current situation that we're in now? How do we get out of this?
Well, by ending the Federal Reserve, the banks still exist. You're just taking away from the ability to corrupt their lending practices, is what
Take away their fractional reserve lending?
You take away the fractional reserve money, put them back in the same kind of economic reality that we live in. If you don't have it, you don't lend it.
Or go borrow it from somebody or the federal government. The federal government can loan you all the money you want to loan.
Correct.
Right?
But you pay it back at a proper interest and not this fictional bond issues they have from 1917 with the Liberty bonds.
Okay, so for example, if I'm the federal government and I'm actually loaning the central bank money so they can go do their loans, I'm collecting an interest from the central bank now.
Correct.
That means I'm funding the federal government's bill on interest and not on tax dollars, right?
Correct.
So therefore I can give this money back to the economy so it doesn't get destroyed out of the economy. The money circulates back to the people.
But we have an endemic corrupted culture in D.C. that dates way before the 20th century. It dates back to, you need to look at the history, I believe 1895, 1896, when the federal Congress was $100 million short that year. And that was in hard 1896 currencies before all this massive inflation. And they went to J.P. Morgan.
J.P. Morgan.
And J.P. Morgan put together just like you said, he put together a hard currency loan to the Congress.
Is there a solution for not renewing the Fed's charter?
Yes, Andrew Jackson.
And we'll get right back to that on the next episode of Liberty Town Hall. Thank you for staying with us today. And look at the Federal Reserve. There's a book called The Creature from Jekyll Island. Please get that. We'll be discussing this in depth on the next episode of Liberty Town Hall. Thank you. God bless.
Children should be educated and instructed in the principles of freedom. Defense of the Constitution, John Adams, 1787.